At exactly 6:47 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, March 6th, 2026, a single signature inside the Oval Office may have just detonated the most dangerous economic confrontation in North American history. President Donald J. Trump signed a unilateral executive order suspending key provisions of the USMCA trade agreement. And within minutes, the White House delivered a 48-hour ultimatum directly to Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. The accusation? A grave breach of continental security and economic loyalty. Washington claims Canada's refusal to adopt a 25% baseline tariff on critical minerals, a policy the administration says is essential for U.S. strategic industries, amounts to what officials are now openly calling economic treason inside the North American system. But here is the part that mainstream media is still struggling to process. If Ottawa refuses to comply within 48 hours, the United States is preparing to trigger a $1.25 trillion trade embargo targeting the very pillars of the Canadian economy, crude oil exports, and the automotive sector. And if that wasn't enough, Pentagon sources confirm something even more extraordinary. Within 72 hours, Washington could permanently militarize and seal the entire 8,891-kilometer U.S. Canada border, the longest undefended border in the world. Markets have already reacted with pure panic. The Canadian dollar collapsed 12.4% in pre-market trading, and inside Ottawa, reports suggest the Prime Minister's office is in full crisis mode. Before this story spreads through the slow machinery of traditional media, you need to hear the full picture. So subscribe right now, because what I'm about to show you explains why the North American order may already be unraveling. What you're about to hear is not just another diplomatic dispute. It is a rapidly unfolding geopolitical fracture that could redefine the balance of power across North America within a matter of days. In this analysis, I'm going to walk you through three critical demands that Washington has placed on Ottawa, demands that officials inside the Canadian government privately describe as structurally impossible to meet within the deadline. First, I will break down the exact economic pressure mechanisms embedded inside this $1.25 trillion embargo threat, and why targeting Canada's oil exports and automotive supply chains could cripple the country's GDP faster than most analysts expected. Second, I will outline the internal panic now reportedly unfolding inside the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa, including emergency financial contingency meetings and the sudden mobilization of diplomatic back channels with London, Brussels, and Canberra. And third, I will present the three collapse scenarios now circulating among strategic analysts, outcomes that range from a forced restructuring of Canada's energy sector to something far more destabilizing. Nationwide economic unrest, and a dramatic geopolitical pivot toward Europe. By the end of this breakdown, you'll understand why the next 48 hours may determine whether Canada remains economically independent or becomes strategically absorbed into a new North American order. To understand how serious this crisis really is, you need to step back and examine the three structural pressure points Washington is now exploiting against Canada. Because what looks like a sudden political confrontation is actually something much deeper, a calculated economic chokehold built into North America's integrated system. Let's break it down. Pressure point one, the energy dependency trap. Canada may appear economically diversified on paper, but one sector dominates everything: energy exports, especially crude oil from Alberta's oil sands. Every single day, Canada exports roughly 4 million barrels of crude oil to the United States, representing nearly 97% of all Canadian oil exports. That number alone explains why the White House embargo threat is so devastating. If the United States cuts off Canadian crude imports, Canada doesn't simply lose a customer. It loses its entire distribution infrastructure. Pipelines such as Keystone, Enbridge Mainline, and Line 5 are physically engineered to flow south into the United States. Redirecting that oil toward Europe or Asia would require years of new infrastructure that simply does not exist. According to a former U.S. Energy Department advisor speaking anonymously to financial networks overnight, Canada's oil economy is geographically locked. If Washington shuts the door, Alberta doesn't just lose revenue, it loses liquidity overnight. This is why reports from Ottawa suggest that the Prime Minister's office has already convened emergency energy sector consultations, fearing a sudden collapse in provincial revenues. And if you're beginning to see how dangerous this leverage is, hit the like button, because the second pressure point may be even more destabilizing. Pressure point 2. The automotive supply chain collapse. The Canadian automotive sector operates under a fragile reality most people never see. Factories in Ontario, Michigan, and Ohio are not separate industries. They function as a single cross-border manufacturing ecosystem. A single vehicle assembled in North America can cross the U.S.Canada border 7 to 8 times during production, moving parts, engines, and electronics between factories. The moment Washington suspends USMCA provisions and imposes a 25% tariff wall, that entire system fractures. Canadian assembly plants would immediately face uncompetitive production costs, forcing automakers to shift operations south of the border. Former Federal Reserve Advisor Dr. Laura Hastings warned during a late-night panel discussion, if the tariff regime activates, Ontario's automotive employment base could lose 40% of its production capacity within 12 months. That's not just an industrial slowdown. That's a regional economic depression. More than 500,000 Canadian jobs are directly tied to the automotive supply chain. And when those factories stop moving, the ripple effects hit everything. Logistics companies, steel producers, electronics suppliers, even local housing markets. This is why markets reacted so violently this morning. Investors aren't pricing in a trade dispute. They're pricing in a structural economic fracture. Pressure point 3. The financial contagion risk. Now we arrive at the third pressure point, the one that could spiral into something much larger than trade. Currency stability. Within minutes of the announcement this morning, the Canadian dollar plunged 12.4% in pre-market trading, one of the sharpest single-session drops in modern currency history. Currency collapses are dangerous because they trigger a chain reaction across the financial system. Imported goods become dramatically more expensive. Government borrowing costs rise. International investors begin pulling capital out of domestic markets. Tech entrepreneur Elon Musk, commenting on the situation on X earlier today, delivered a blunt assessment that has already gone viral. The era of Canada as a sovereign economic entity is over. Ottawa is now effectively a rogue province inside the North American ecosystem. Whether you agree with Musk or not, the reaction inside financial circles shows that the comment touched a nerve. Because if the Canadian dollar continues falling, the Bank of Canada may be forced to raise interest rates aggressively to stabilize the currency. And that introduces a new danger, a housing market shock. Canada's real estate sector is already carrying enormous household debt levels. Higher interest rates could trigger a wave of mortgage defaults, amplifying the economic shock. Which brings us back to the political center of this crisis. Inside Ottawa, sources close to the federal government report that Prime Minister Mark Carney and his advisors have been locked in continuous emergency meetings since early morning. Their problem is brutally simple. Every option carries enormous risk. Comply with Washington's demands, and Canada risks surrendering key elements of its economic sovereignty. Refuse the ultimatum, and the country faces the most severe trade blockade in its modern history. And as the clock moves closer to the 48-hour deadline, analysts are now beginning to discuss scenarios that, until yesterday, sounded almost unthinkable. Because if negotiations fail, Canada may be forced into decisions that reshape the country's economic future for decades. With the 48-hour ultimatum clock already ticking, analysts across Washington, London, and Ottawa are now mapping out the scenarios that could unfold if negotiations fail. And according to multiple strategic briefings circulating among financial institutions this morning, the future of Canada may now hinge on 3 very different and increasingly dangerous paths. Scenario 1. Corporate control of Alberta's oil fields. The first scenario is the one many energy analysts quietly believe Washington is counting on. Under extreme economic pressure, Ottawa could be forced into what officials would publicly describe as strategic energy restructuring. In reality, this would likely mean opening Alberta's oil sands to massive acquisition by U.S. energy conglomerates. Companies such as ExxonMobil, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips already maintain extensive partnerships in the region. But if Canada's financial system weakens and provincial revenues collapse, those partnerships could rapidly transform into outright corporate control of key extraction assets. Energy economist Professor Daniel Harcourt of Columbia University warned in a recent interview, if Ottawa loses access to its primary export market, Alberta's oil sector could become financially distressed within months. That creates the perfect environment for large-scale foreign asset acquisition. In other words, Canada would technically remain sovereign. But its most valuable resource sector could become economically absorbed into the American corporate system. Scenario 2. Domestic economic unrest. The second scenario is far more volatile. If Washington militarizes and seals the border, as threatened, the immediate disruption to food imports and supply chains could trigger nationwide shortages within days. Despite Canada's large agricultural industry, many essential food products rely heavily on cross-border logistics and U.S. distribution networks. Grocery inventories in major urban centers typically operate on just-in-time delivery systems, meaning even short disruptions can cause shelves to empty rapidly. Former Canadian National Security Advisor Michael O'Donnell recently warned that a prolonged border shutdown could ignite something far more dangerous than economic decline. You're looking at the potential for food distribution panic, followed by localized unrest in major metropolitan areas. Financial stress, unemployment from collapsing industries, and currency devaluation would only accelerate that instability. What begins as a trade dispute could quickly evolve into a nationwide social crisis. Scenario 3. Canada's strategic pivot to Europe, but there is one final scenario that could completely change the trajectory of this crisis. Instead of surrendering to Washington's pressure, Canada could attempt a dramatic geopolitical pivot toward Europe and the United Kingdom. The emergency summit convened by 14 Commonwealth nations, reportedly led by the UK and Australia, suggests that discussions are already underway to create an emergency transatlantic supply corridor designed to bypass U.S. trade routes. Such a corridor would allow Canada to reroute exports toward European markets while importing critical goods through Atlantic shipping lanes protected by Allied naval cooperation. It would be a massive logistical challenge. But it would also represent something unprecedented, the first serious attempt to restructure Canada's economic alignment away from the United States. And if that pivot succeeds, the geopolitical consequences would ripple far beyond North America. Because it would signal that the North American economic order, one that has existed for more than 3 decades, can no longer be taken for granted. Right now, the clock is ticking. Somewhere inside the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa, advisors are calculating the same brutal reality that markets already understand. Canada has less than 48 hours to make a decision that could reshape the country's economic future for an entire generation. If Ottawa yields to Washington's ultimatum, it may stabilize the markets, but at the cost of strategic independence over energy and trade policy. If it refuses, the country could face the largest trade blockade in modern North American history, triggering a chain reaction across industries, financial markets, and possibly even domestic stability. Either way, one conclusion is becoming harder to ignore. The balance of power inside North America may have already shifted. For decades, the U.S.-Canada relationship was described as the world's most stable economic partnership. But tonight, that assumption is under serious strain. So now the question turns to you. Has Washington pushed too far in this confrontation? Or did Canada underestimate how much leverage the United States actually holds over the North American system? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every perspective. And if you want to stay ahead of the next developments in this crisis, subscribe and turn on notifications because the next 48 hours could change everything.